Now, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 2 on chemical foundation of life. So in part 1 of the lecture video, we were just got done by discussing what defines as ionic bonds versus covalent bonds and what is the difference between those two. Now we can further categorize covalent bonds into two different subcategories known as polar versus nonpolar covalent bonds. So this subcategory of covalent bond stems from another physical property of elements called electronegativity, which is defined as how attractive are electrons to the central nucleus of the atom. Some elements have a higher electronegativity, where it has a higher affinity for electrons. So more electrons like to hang around that particular atom. So while others that have lower electronegativity, those electrons tend to spend less time around them. So you can think of it as kind of like that atom, with a higher electronegativity is a little bit more greedy. They hog all the electrons, whereas those that have lower electronegativity can't have all those electrons. They're kind of hogged by that atom with a higher electronegativity. So these differences in electronegativity is what can result in unequal sharing of electrons between molecules that are formed by covalent bonds. Okay, why I know talking about greedy and hogging is because we talked about sharing of electrons, but not all the time that sharing of electrons is equal, meaning that is equal amount of electrons on both sides. Okay, just like two children trying to hog toys to themselves, not all the time can they evenly divide the toys amongst themselves. So unequal sharing of electrons can also occur between molecules that are formed by covalent bonds, because the electrons can be more attracted to the one atom over the other based on the fact that one atom have a higher electronegativity. So most of the electrons end up spending more time around that particular atom, which gives it a slightly negative charge. Okay, slightly negative charge. So the one with a higher electronegativity, which is this one right here, would have a slightly negative charge because more electrons tend to hang around that particular atom and zooms around that atom more often than the other one. Okay. So this delta symbol that you're seeing here is what signifies the slight charge, okay? Not a complete charge like ionic bonds, okay? We're not creating ions here. We're not creating positive charge ion, cation, or anion. We're just having that slight charge due to that unequal distribution of electron between the two atoms, And like what I was saying, the atom with a higher electronegative is more greedy with electrons. They hog them more often to themselves, and hence the rest of the electrons are less likely to want to share the electrons with this particular atom here, giving it that slight positive charge or delta positive because less electrons are hanging around that particular atom. So a perfect example for this unequal distribution of electrons between covalent bonds, which we call polar covalent bond. Okay, polar covalent bond is in the molecule of water. Okay, so polar covalent bonds has to do with unequal sharing of electron. And in the case of water molecule, we've just talked about how the oxygen should share electrons with the two hydrogens right here, okay? But this sharing of electrons turns out to be unequal because oxygen has a higher electronegativity than hydrogen do, okay? So that is why more electrons tend to hang around the oxygen than it is to around the hydrogen molecules, which results in oxygen being a slight negative charge, and the hydrogens here, these two, with a slight positive charge. Okay, so when there's no difference in electronegativity between two atoms of a molecule, then we refer to this type of covalent bond as nonpolar covalent bond, because they equally share electrons. Okay, at this, they share that same amount of electrons between the two atoms or more. Okay, and a good example of a nonpolar covalent bond is a molecule of methane, which is made up of one carbon and 4 hydrogen. Okay, CH4. And the central carbon here has 4 electrons, and they will share 4 more to fill its valence shell with 4 different hydrogen molecules. And there is no, partial negative or partial positive charge in the case of methane, because the electrons are equally shared amongst the 4 hydrogens and the carbon. Okay, there's no one point in time where there's more electrons hanging around the carbon than the hydrogen. Okay, so and on average, they are really equally sharing between all 5 of these atoms, which results in a non-polar covalent bond. Whereas for water, electrons are hanging more around the oxygen, giving it slight partial negative charge and partial positive charge on the hydrogen. Okay, with this unequal sharing of electron is what we refer to as polar covalent bond. So a third type of chemical bond we will discuss is called hydrogen bonds, which are considered as weaker bonds than covalent and ionic bonds. Hydrogen bonds, okay, so weaker bonds, and hydrogen bonds are usually formed not within the molecule itself. So we're not gonna, there's no hydrogen bond between oxygen and hydrogen within the same water molecule, but we're talking about between multiple molecule. And this is what we can, differentiate between intramolecular interactions versus intermolecular interaction. Intra means within the same molecule. Inter means between molecules. And what we talked about as ionic bond and covalent bond can happen as inter or intramolecular, but hydrogen bonds is usually intermolecular type of bonding than intra. Okay. So for example, remember we talked about how water is formed by polar covalent bond, where the oxygen is slightly negative charge while the hydrogens are slightly positive charge. What happens is that the multiple water molecules can interact with each other through these slight charges, and we call these hydrogen bonds. Okay, just like how when we had ionic bond, there is that attraction between negative anion and positive cation. They like to be attracted to each other because of opposite of charges. Well, same thing in this case, but just not very strongly ionic bonds, due to it's just a slight negative charge and a slight positive charge that are attracted to each other. And here's an illustration of what happens between 2 water molecules, or between even more water molecules. Okay, it usually doesn't hydrogen bonds with just one water molecule. It can go on to form hydrogen bonds with more water molecule. So here's oxygen in the middle right there, that is signified by the red ball, and this is hydrogen. Okay, so that's signifying H2O in water, and hydrogen have a slight positive charge, so is likely to form that hydrogen bond with the slight negative charge of oxygen. Well, here, this partial positive charge can also bond with another water molecules where it is interacting with the slight negative charge of the oxygen of a third water molecule. And here, this oxygen molecule being slightly negative charge can interact with a fourth water molecule by interacting with another water molecule's partial positive charge hydrogen. Okay, so this can go on and on and on and on in a whole chain of water molecules that are all linked to each other via these hydrogen bonds due to the existence of these partial charges of the oxygen atom and the partial positive charge of the hydrogen atoms. Or hydrogen bonds can also exist between nucleotides of DNA, which is symbolized by these dots here. So these are your hydrogen bonds, and these are your 4 nucleotide you can have in the DNA molecule that we'll talk about in chapter 3. Your A, T, C's, and G, the 4 nucleotides that make up your DNA sequence, and how this particular line of DNA molecule and this particular line of DNA molecule, why they can interact with each other to form that double helix is because of formation of these hydrogen bonds between the 2 strands of DNA molecule. Okay, we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 3 and talk about DNA structure in detail. Oh, and also we'll talk about this when we get to later chapters in the semester when we talk about DNA structure in immense detail. Okay. All right. So the last type of interaction we'll talk about in this chapter is called van der Waals interaction, which are the weakest of the 4 types of chemical bonds that we have discussed. Okay, so according to biology, covalent bond is the strongest, followed by ionic, and then you have your weak hydrogen intermolecular interaction, and then van der Waals interaction, the weakest type. Now, van der Waals interaction is the weakest type because it's not based on even slight charges, okay? At least with hydrogen bonds, we have these partial slight negative or positive charge atoms that are interacting with each other. For van der Waals interaction, it's based on slight fluctuation of electron density clouds that 2 molecules can have some sort of interaction with each other, okay? So it's not even based on slight charges. It's just maybe in that one point in time, that particular electron cloud is on one side of the molecule, which then allows it to interact with another atom. I'll show you what I mean. So for this type of interaction to occur, the 2 molecules need to be very close to one another, okay, to each other. So what do we mean by slight fluctuation of electron clouds between molecules that I was talking about? Well, these 2 illustrations here, right here, provides a good image of what is going on when we have van der Waals interaction. Now, we usually think of atoms where there is equal or symmetrical distribution of electrons zooming around the central nucleus of the atom in that spherical conformation, okay, which is why I pointed that out when we were watching that animation of those atoms forming ionic and covalent bond. But you saw that those electrons weren't equally flying around the central nucleus in a spherical manner. Sometimes they were, but sometimes you see the electron kind of grouping towards the side or grouping towards this side in this particular manner, okay? So, it's not in that spherical conformation we drew in the Bohr model is not entirely accurate because the electrons are basically just randomly zooming around the nucleus in all sorts of direction, as you can see in this animated animation here. Those yellow balls, which are the electrons, are just zooming around the central nucleus in any conformation they want. And at a random point in time, those electrons that can momentarily be on, all of those electrons be on one particular side of the nucleus, like what is depicted here. And what is depicted here, those electron clouds tend to be on this side in one moment in time, or on this side of the molecule in one point in time. That if, excuse me, and when another atom is close enough in proximity that is also experiencing this, what we call asymmetrical distribution of electron cloud, that particular electron cloud then can interact with the positive or slightly positive charged nucleus of the other atom. Remember, the nucleus is mainly made up of protons and neutrons. Neutrons don't have charge. Protons is the positive charge. Okay, so this slight moment in time where the electron density is on one side of the atom can potentially interact with some sort of attraction to the other atom's positive charge nucleus. Okay, so this only happens when we're talking of that slight asymmetrical distribution of electrons clouds, and that's why this is the weakest of the four, because it's just based on that one moment in time where the electron distribution is unequal amongst in that non-spherical conformation. Okay, all right. And so we have just went through four main common types of chemical bonding that can occur between two atoms or part of a molecule. You have ionic, okay, which are between two charged particles, completely charged, meaning it involves electron transfer of some sort. One is giving up an electron and another is accepting the electrons to form cations and anions. You have covalent bonds, which are signified by equal or unequal sharing of electron. If it's unequal sharing of electron, we call it polar covalent bond. If it's equal sharing, we call it nonpolar covalent bond. And then you have hydrogen bonds, which are formed by that slight negative and slight positive charge between a hydrogen and another atom. It doesn't have to be oxygen within water molecules, as we have seen in the DNA molecules, okay, as it can be a hydrogen and a nitrogen or other types of atoms. And then you have van der Waals as your fourth type of chemical bonds or interactions, which is the weakest of the four, based on asymmetrical distribution of electron clouds, okay? So those, in addition to others that we have not talked about, and I'm sure you'll visit the others in chemistry, all of those interaction can contribute to one of the major biomacromolecules we will discuss in the next chapter, proteins, okay? And we will consistently hear about proteins in every biology class because they make up everything in our body and participate in a whole variety of different functions. Some are for structural purposes, some are for reactions by acting as enzymes, which we'll talk about immensely in chapter 6 in metabolism. And some can form channels on cell membranes for communication or things to travel in and out of the cell. We'll talk a little bit about that as well when we talk about plasma membrane in chapter 5. We cannot live or survive without the use of proteins. Everything in our cells have or involve proteins, okay? And hence, that's why I talk about protein here. And one of the key things that drives protein functions in our body is their unique shape and structure that they will form. Now, we're not talking about two-dimensional, but the three-dimensional fold-up shape, okay? So usually a protein, when it's first made, is in that, little string of amino acids, but that can be folded into a three-dimensional shape, like a little ball or something. And that little ball, three-dimensional structure is what gives its function a lot of times, okay? And usually I would talk about how structure of protein is to function. Okay, structure is to function. You don't have the structure, you don't have the function. Okay, which is why we bring up the idea of denaturation of proteins when we get to that particular chapter about enzymes. Okay, so what gives proteins their function, like I said, is their structure. So their three-dimensional structure is very critical for their function, and that three-dimensional structure is driven by the chemical interaction that can happen within the protein as depicted by this particular image here. This is, of course, an overly simplified image of what a protein looks like. We're just looking at, for example, this particular loop here of the protein and zooming in into what can happen. So we'll learn in the next chapter that proteins are made up of single amino acids. And amino acids, you have 20 of them, and different amino acids can have different, what we call side chains. Okay, and these side chain kind of stick out of the main backbone of the protein itself. But so these side chains can interact with each other in form of hydrogen bond that we talked about, in form of ionic bonds we talked about, because this is a positively charged amino acid and this is a negative charged amino acid, and opposites attract each other to form the ionic bond. Or there can be van der Waals interaction we talked about in these three particular amino acid side chains. Okay, so that's why we talked about those four different types of interaction, because they are what drives the ultimate configuration or three-dimensional structure of a protein that makes them functional. Okay, which is very critical in biology. And a disulfide bond here is a good example of a covalent bond that can be formed between two side chains. Okay, they just specifically called it a disulfide bond because it's a covalent bond formed between two sulfur atoms for those two particular amino acids. So and because of the numerous amount of possible interaction different molecules can form with each other, we can have numerous different three-dimensional shapes proteins can be formed into. Some proteins can be helical in structure. Some proteins can take this, curved structure. Some proteins can even be a barrel type of structure where it can serve as a little channel that goes through plasma membrane. Some can be, of course, other types of three-dimensional structure that gives its shape for its function. Okay, barrel shape with a hole in the middle of it, so it serves as a channel. Or in antibodies, it is in this Y particular shape for antibodies of our immune system. And why is in this Y particular shape is because here is where it can bind to particular antigens on a bacteria. For example, here's a bacteria swimming around in your bloodstream, and antibodies can bind to the bacteria and surrender them so that they will be engulfed by your immune system cells. Okay, we'll slightly talk about it when we get to, again, the plasma membrane chapter. But this will be, go into detail when you get to microbiology or anatomy and physiology. Okay. All right, so now let's switch gears to talk a bit about water, since we talked about how water is one of the most critical molecules of life that is needed in many organisms, which is why we sort of introduced the some classic example of the polar covalent bond and hydrogen bonds, and we use water as an example because they are so critical for different processes of life. So that's why about 70% of the earth is covered with water, because water is very important. 60 to 70% of the human body itself is comprised of water. And when we go down in the hierarchy of organization, to the level of a cell, 75% of a cell's weight is contributed by water. One of the important aspects why everything has a good amount of water is that most chemical reactions in a biological system needs to happen in water as a medium, and sometimes even as part of the chemical reaction itself, as we will see later in the next chapter. For example, in cellular respiration, or for metabolism's purposes, or when we talk about synthesis of macromolecules versus breaking of macromolecules, both of those involve water. Okay, water as a reactant itself, or water as a side product itself. Okay. So that's why water is important, because they are important in different parts, in all aspects of life, basically. So there are a number of special properties of water that makes it very important for maintaining life, and we will go through each of these unique properties of water in this following segment of the lecture. So first of all, we have already discussed that water molecules are formed by polar covalent bonds, which gives them that partial negative charge on the oxygen side and partial positive charge on the hydrogen side. And we call this property of water its polarity. Okay, it is a polar molecule because of that difference of slight, negative and positive charges. And the polarity of a water molecules allows it to, kind of act like a magnet, a little magnet, where the slightly negative charged oxygen will be attracted to the slightly positive charged hydrogen of another molecule, forming what we have just discussed as the hydrogen bond. So here's one water molecule which can form a hydrogen bond with this water molecule, form a hydrogen with this water molecule, and so on and so forth. Okay, based on the fact that you have that slight positive charge on hydrogen and slight negative charge on that particular oxygen. And there are substances that will interact with water nicely, and those that repels water depending on the physical property of the molecule itself. There are two different types. One that like to react with water, one that don't like to react with water. And those that interact with water nicely are usually also polar themselves, okay? And we refer to them as hydrophilic. Okay, hydrophilic. Okay, so a good easy way to remember that is by the word that it spells as. Okay, hydro for water. Okay, hydro usually means it's something to do with water. Philic usually mean liking. Yeah, you like it. So water loving. Okay, water loving. Hydrophilic. Those that don't interact with water are usually non-polar substances, and for example lipids, and they tend to stay away from water, and we refer to those molecules as hydrophobic. Again, hydro for water, phobic for not liking. Okay, so not liking water. And this can easily be seen when we think about vinegar versus oil. Okay, we like to dip our little Italian bread in a sauce where we have the olive oil and the vinegar. And when you first pour the vinegar into the olive oil, you will see these dots of vinegar in your oil. Okay, so oil is a non-polar molecule, whereas vinegar is a polar molecule that can dissolve in water. And oil don't like water, hydrophobic. Vinegar is hydrophilic, which is why you have this separation of the two phases of molecules, okay? And that's why they say water and oil don't mix, is because they don't interact with each other. They cannot. Water only interact with things that are polar, okay? Or if they are ions, okay? All right. So there are, so that's a polarity of water, and we'll come back to the idea of why the polarity of water is important in the, in another unique property of water. Okay, but for now, we'll discuss another unique property of water, which is that water have 3 different states of matter, depending on temperature. The higher temperature acts as a form of heat energy. Here is the higher temperature versus lower temperature. When you have higher temperature, excuse me, the heat energy that radiates from the higher temperature will move molecules around faster and increase the amount of collisions that can occur. So they're bouncing around all the time, far apart from each other, and because they have all this energy of bouncing around. Okay, so they go boom, zoom, 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 bounce around, bounce around everywhere because of that high amount of energy from the high temperature you have. So this bouncing around hydrogen of water molecules with that high energy, it breaks the hydrogen bonds between the molecules. So then they are turned into a state of matter called gas. Okay, they break the hydrogen bonds to form that gaseous state. Okay, which is what's represented here in form of steam when we see water at higher temperatures, such as in hot springs or when you're boiling a pot of water over the stove. Now, at lower temperature, for example, at room temperature, there is less heat available, and the water molecule slows down their movement. Okay, so it slows down, and it allows for formation of hydrogen bonds once again between different water molecules and give them what's called surface tension. Okay, a concept that we will talk about next. This is called the liquid state of water, where water molecules are still sort of moving around everywhere, but they're at a much slower rate, and that they're just sliding past each other, constantly forming and breaking hydrogen bonds with each other. Okay, hence, for example, the flowy stream of waterfalls, etc. Those are formed by the liquid state of water. And at very, very low temperatures, such as 0 degrees Celsius, as represented right here, is where, almost no heat energy is available to allow any movement of water molecules. So they slow down quite a bit and will form a crystalline structure, such as this, then they turn into somewhat of a solid state of matter called ice. Okay, so gas, liquid, and solid state of matter. Okay, and for water, the solid state of matter is ice. Now, the hydrogen bonds are still there between the water molecules, that we can see these lines here. Okay, but they are no longer constantly breaking and forming like it was sliding past each other in the liquid formation. In the liquid state. In solid state, those hydrogen bonds are all kind of stuck there. Okay, they're not moving. And something special about the water's solid state is that its density at solid state is actually lower than water at liquid state. Okay, so ice has a lower density than liquid water. And density can be seen as how densely packed together these molecules are up against each other. At liquid state, you can see here in this particular picture where there are a lot of water molecules that are packed next to each other, even though they're, moving and sliding past each other. But you see a lot more water molecules, and you see very little blue background space between them. At solid state, however, okay, they go into a more stable crystallized structure that makes these somewhat of a hexagon shape between them, in these hexagon patterns. And there are a lot more empty space in the background. You can see a lot of blue here and there between water molecule, and hence ice is less dense than water at liquid state, which allows ice to float on water just like this. That's why huge iceberg and glaciers can float on top of water, because they are less dense than water. Now, this is a special property of water that, that allows for fishes in really cold areas of the world to be able to live and swim below the ice, or else the entire lake would just be full of ice chunks, sink to the bottom, and that would limit the space for organisms to live in. But because of this unique property of water where ice is actually less dense than liquid itself, that's why fishes can still swim in those cold places. The next two unique properties of water looks at its heat capacity and heat of vaporization. Now, water is known to have the highest specific heat capacity of any liquids. So what does that mean? Well, specific heat is defined as the amount of heat 1 gram of substance must absorb or lose to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. Meaning, how much heat do we need to change that particular substance by 1 degree Celsius in temperature? Okay. So water having a very high specific heat capacity, the capacity meaning how much heat it can store, it means that it takes a long time for it to heat up enough and also a long time to cool. Now, an easy way to think about heat capacity, water takes a long time to heat, long time to cool, and an analogy that makes this clear is think about the beach as analogy right here. This is the beach, and if you have been to the beach, when we walk around the sand of the beach in barefoot, sometimes it can feel as if the bottom of your feet is burning, but as soon as you get into the water, you're relieved by the coolness of the water around your feet. Why is that the case? Both the sand and the sun, technically speaking, are exposed to the same amount of heat energy coming from the sun. But yet, these two substances feel quite different in temperature. The sand feels a lot hotter than it is the water. Why is that the case? Well, that's not because the sun can choose to heat up the sand more than water. Both substances are exposed to the same amount of sun rays. You can't say that the sun likes the sand better, so they're sending more heat to the sand. It's sending the same amount of heat energy. But it has to do with the different heat capacity that sand has compared to water. Sand takes a lot less heat to change the temperature of the sand, but a lot more heat to change the temperature of the water. If one has to heat up, for example, you think about a stove and 2 pots. In one pot, you're going to heat up a pot of sand, and in another pot, you're going to heat up a pot of water on the stove top, and you're going to turn it on to the same amount of heat in the 2 pots. The sand will probably start feeling hot a lot sooner than the water does, because the sand has a much lower heat capacity than water. So this is another reason why organisms contain a good portion of water, because it will prevent large fluctuation in temperature inside the body. It takes a lot more heat to change temperature of water. So imagine if water was a low heat capacity type of deal. If water was just like sand, where a little bit of sun is gonna start boiling the water, that will be problematic. Imagine if an animal's body liquid starts to, or whatever liquid content that animal's body has, and it starts to boil every time it steps out into the sun. That animal's not going to survive. We're exposed to the sun all the time, but yet those animals don't die from, heat exhaustion or boiling of liquid inside their bodies, because water is a good heat reservoir. It allows heat to sort of takes a long time before it starts changing the temperature of the body. And the other thing water does for the body is it allows heat to be evenly dispersed in the body for each individual. Okay, so that way the water keeps circulating around in our blood or within our cells. Those is what allows heat to be evenly distributed throughout. We won't have a hot arm and then a cool leg unless we, of course, dip our leg in cold water. But usually our body temperature is pretty even throughout the body. All right, so a property of water related to heat capacity, but is slightly different, is the heat of vaporization. Okay, so water also has a high heat of vaporization, which is defined as the amount of energy required to change 1 gram of liquid substance into gaseous state, which is why it's called heat of vaporization. Okay, how much heat it takes to vaporize that particular substance. So remember that this is different from heat capacity. Okay, specific heat capacity is how much heat it takes to change 1 gram of substance by 1 degree Celsius, whereas heat of vaporization is talking about how much energy it is to change that particular of liquid substance from liquid state into another state of matter, your gaseous state. Okay. And this makes sense because we have just discussed previously that it takes a lot of heat to change the temperature of a certain amount of water. So likewise, it will also take a lot of heat to raise the temperature of water enough for it to change from liquid to gaseous state of matter. This is why water will only boil at very high temperatures, such as 100 degrees Celsius, and because it can hold so much heat as liquid format before changing to a gaseous state, we say that water is also a good heat reservoir. Okay, so it holds a lot of heat within that liquid state before it starts steaming like this and vaporizing into their gaseous state. But before reaching the boiling point of 100 degrees Celsius, some of those water molecules on the surface is still able to escape and vaporize into that gaseous state. So this is why before the water, starts to really boil in a pot over the stove, for example, in this illustration here, you will already see some steam coming off the surface of the water when it gets hot enough. Okay, so it can still evaporate below the boiling point. Now, because water can trap a lot of heat, when it evaporates, it can also remove that amount of heat from the surrounding environment or surface and cool it, which explains why sweating, like here, enables our bodies to cool down. Okay, so having those little droplets of water all over the surface of our skin allows for the liquid to trap some of that heat from our bodies, and when the sweat evaporates, it also takes heat along with it, ultimately achieving that cooling of our body. So that's why sweating is a natural way that our body can maintain homeostasis of body temperature. Remember what homeostasis means from chapter 1, that maintenance of stabilized body internal environment. Okay, and one attribute of that internal environment is our body temperature, and sweating helps us to maintain that. Okay, so another unique property of water that is considered that we have is that it is considered as a good solvent. A solvent is defined as a substance that is capable of dissolving other molecules. Well, because water is a polar molecule that we have discussed earlier with that partial positive charge and partial negative charge, they are only capable of dissolving other polar molecules and ionic compounds, which is why we have the difference of hydrophilic items versus hydrophobic items is because depending on the physical property or chemical property of that particular molecule, if it's polar ionic, it's going to be hydrophilic. If it's nonpolar, then it will be hydrophobic. And we talked about how sodium ions and chloride ions can come together to form a molecule called sodium chloride. And many sodium chloride molecules can be packed next to each other to form a block of solid salt. So you have your sodium chloride, and they can form many sodium chloride to form a block of salt that we see in crystals of salt. And then what we can see in this image here is, sort of a partial part of a block of salt that has been dunked into a body of liquid, for example. Okay, so when this block of salt is submerged in, let's say this is a whole big beaker or tub of water, okay, that we're dunking this salt of sodium chloride block into. And what happens is, remember that water molecules are polar, where the oxygen is partial negative charge. That's why you have these negative symbols next to the red circle. And then the hydrogen is partial positive charge, which is why you have these positive symbol next to the white circle representing the hydrogen. They can surround the block of salt by opposite charges and start to pull the ions apart from the block of solid salt to individual ions again. Okay, so this is the chloride, this is the sodium, and what happens is that one ion can be surrounded by water molecules at all sides like this, and we call this the sphere of hydration. For example, sodium ion here is surrounded by a whole sphere of hydration because the sodium ion, being positive charge, is attracted to the partial negative charge of oxygen within each water molecule. The chloride ion here, being negative charge, is attracted to the partial positive charge of hydrogen atoms in these water molecules. So that's how water can dissolve a solid and why they can keep the particles separated from each other in water so that salt won't all of a sudden start forming solids again in water. Once you distribute and stir some crystals of salt in the water to get it to dissolve, those salt is not going to all of a sudden come back as solids again unless you, of course, evaporate the water. But other than that, those salt is going to stay as individualized ions after it's been dissolved because of this sphere of hydration that can be formed around these ions, pulling these ions off the block of salt one by one and keep them all separated from each other. So you have a whole beaker of water full of sodium ions and chloride ions floating around all your water molecules. Okay? Oh, and let me erase that so we're not confused as what we're talking about. Okay. So chemically speaking, the ionic bonds between sodium and chloride ions were disrupted by water molecule in a process called dissociation, and those atoms will break apart, okay, as we have seen here, as a chloride ion breaks out or the sodium ion breaks out. And they would form those individual ions again. And the same process goes for how a block of sugar crystal is able to dissolve in water due to that sphere of hydration that can form around each of those individual sugar molecules. Now, there are two more properties of water that is a result of the polarity of water molecules. You have cohesion and adhesion, and we'll talk about cohesion first. But these two properties sound very similar, cohesion, adhesion, but they mean two different things. So be sure you understand the difference between the two. Cohesion is when water molecules are attracted to each other, so water attracted to other water molecules via hydrogen bonding that keeps them together at that liquid gas interface. So this is what we talked about earlier, how a water molecule here is attracted to another water molecule via hydrogen bonds. So that's a type of cohesion property where the two water molecules are attracted to each other, which is what we explained earlier, okay? So this cohesive property of water is what gives water its surface tension, okay? Surface tension, which is the capacity of a substance to withstand rupturing when placed under tension or stress. This can be illustrated by what is going on here in this particular picture, right here. Again, this particular picture. Imagine if this was a container full of water molecules, and what's below the water surface are one water molecule interacting with multiple water molecules all around. Okay, this is surrounded by water molecules that is attracted to each other in all possible directions. But at the surface right here, there is an interface between the liquid water and the atmosphere, just air. So these water molecules on the surface of the container are attracted to each other like this, okay, on the surface of the water. But nothing else can attach to them on the other side, in the environment or the air. So that's why this attraction here between these water molecules will create something called the surface tension. And that's why when we look at the surface of our cars after the rain, we will see some water droplets on top of the metal. Is because small amount of water will be attracted to each other to form these little droplets. The same surface tension can be utilized that allows for DNA sample to be floated on top of a water droplet for DNA to stick on the sample reading surface, such as right here. So we have a water droplet, okay, and then sometimes we would add DNA sample to it where it floats up on top and would stick to that particular interface right there that we look at DNA under the microscope, electron microscope specifically. And also explains why some insects or a piece of needle can float on water due to the surface tension that will be able to hold the object up. With in-person class, I usually give my students a classroom activity where I challenge them to see how many paper clips are they able to float on the surface of a cup of water. It illustrates the strength of that surface tension that water molecules can generate to hold up the weight of multiple number of paper clips. So you can try this at home too. Grab a cup of water, and then you have paper clips or, staples, whatever it is, kind of thin and light, and then see if you can float them on the surface of the water due to the surface tension that is able to hold it up. So the other property of water, as we have mentioned, is called adhesion. And adhesion, as its name suggests, means something adhering to something else. So this is slightly different from cohesion. Cohesion, we're talking about attraction or interaction of water to other water molecules, but adhesion is an attraction between water molecule and other types of molecules, and such as glass surfaces, wood surfaces, things other than water. Okay, so sometimes adhesion is stronger than cohesion, especially if the inner surface where the water molecules are attracted to are charged surfaces, okay? Because remember, water has that polarity with that slight positive and negative charge, and that can happen cause a stronger attraction between the water molecules and the surface if the surface itself was charged. So, for example, capillary action is a perfect example where cohesion and adhesion are working together to pull water up from the beaker. So water goes in to the tubes in this way via something called capillary action. So what's illustrated here is a beaker of water right here. And if you place a small glass tube into the water like this, you will see that some of the water will climb upwards towards within the tube itself and then stop at a certain point. So this is a good demonstration of why adhesion can be stronger than cohesion forces. The inside of the glass tube contains charged surfaces. If we zoom into here, we may be able to see that, there are charged surfaces where the water molecule can be attracted. Okay, water molecule can be attracted to the side wall of the glass itself, or it could be negative. Okay, and the hydrogen can be attached. Okay, depending on the case, but different materials can be charged differently, and so the inside of the glass tube has that charged surface that attract the water molecule. So the water molecules will break the bond between themselves down here and starts traveling up the glass tube and slowly climb up it until it can no longer overcome the force of gravity. Okay, so that's breaking those hydrogen bonds from the rest of the water floating around in the beaker and then start climbing up into the glass. So let me erase that. All right, so those intermolecular interactions of cohesion and adhesion meaning the interaction between the glass and the water, and cohesion meaning the interaction between water and water molecules, have to overcome the force of gravity in order to continue climbing upwards. The intermolecular interaction, and hence this is why the two sizes of tubes illustrated here, a bigger tube versus a smaller tube, can result in different amount of water being pulled upwards, because the weight of the water in the bigger tube is a lot higher than the weight of the water in the smaller tube, so they can be pulled up higher, versus in the bigger tube it will only stop at about right there because of the weight of the water that's pulling down, and it's the weight of the water itself can add to the amount of adhesion forces that adhesion forces have to overcome. Okay, so that's why a bigger versus a smaller tube can contribute into different amount of water being pulled upwards in that capillary action format. So in life application of adhesion and cohesion is how tree roots are able to deliver water from underneath the soil all the way up to the height of the tree trunk to the very tips of the leaves at the top of the tree. Now trees don't have water pump like a water fountain does. So how does water get up to the top? By adhesion forces that allows the water to become attracted to the inside of the hollow space within the roots. So that's that adhesion right there, where the water molecules attracted to the side walls of the roots, and one water molecule will be able to pull another water molecule via cohesion forces. Okay, so that interaction of hydrogen bonds between one molecule and another water molecule will continuously pull up water from the roots all the way up the tree. So kind of similar concept with the capillary action, and there are a lot of these little hollow tubes within the tree trunk that will allow water to flow upwards using these two particular forces, okay, adhesion and cohesion, which stems from water being a polar molecule, which is why we talked about water being a polar molecule being very important. Okay, and the last concept of water in this chapter introduces the concept of pH value of a solution. pH stands short for the power of hydrogen, which indicates the amount of hydrogen ions within a solution. The more hydrogen ions you have in a solution, the lower the pH value, which means it is more acidic. The less hydrogen ions you have, the higher pH value, and it is considered as more alkaline or basic. So technically speaking, hydrogen ions are spontaneous generated in pure water by dissociation, where H2O here can be broken down into their components of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ion. Okay, if you want me to write that down. So this OH group is considered as hydroxide ion. But the equilibrium of this chemical dissociation tends to go towards the formation of water molecules, which is why water itself does not, give a certain acidity or basic, is neutral, okay? But if more hydrogen ions was added to water, let's say we're going to add vinegar or hydrochloric acid to water, then the amount of hydrogen ions will increase in the solution, and the pH value, the numeric value, will be a lower number, less than 7 specifically, and that indicates a solution as acidic. If less amount of hydrogen's ion was available in a solution, the pH numeric value of the solution will increase greater than 7 specifically, and that indicates the solution is basic or more alkaline, whichever way you want to think about it. Okay, alkaline and basic means the same thing. So pH of 7, on the other hand, then means that it is neutral pH, and that's what has to be maintained in human cells and blood by homeostasis. We cannot have acidic blood or, too basic amount of blood, that, results in what we call acidosis and alkalosis. And it is a, health condition that we will discuss in anatomy and physiology if that is your next class. Now, again, remember that acid will always increase the amount of hydrogen ions in the solution, while base, acid increase hydrogen ions, while base will provide either a hydroxide ions or any other negative charge ions to combine with hydrogen and remove them from a solution. Okay, so it doesn't have to be hydrogen ions that a base is providing. It can be bicarbonate ions, that we write as HCO3 minus, so that kind of negative charge, some more sort of negative charge ions that will be able to sequester those extra hydrogen ions in a solution is what makes it a base, All right, so the concept of acid and base, we kind of do a quick introduction here and don't really dive deep into this too much of the chemistry part. We kind of introduce it quickly here because it's a common thing you will see again in anatomy and physiology, microbiology, and a lot more in chemistry. So it's a concept you have to be exposed to as a basic foundation in life sciences. Now, with the concept of changing pH values in a solution comes the concept of what a buffer can do. A buffer. So a buffer is a solution with chemicals that can readily absorb excess hydrogen ions or excess hydroxide ions to keep the body's pH maintained within a very narrow range that is required for our survival. So for example, there exists an important buffer system in our blood that we will talk about quite a bit in anatomy and physiology called the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Bicarbonate ion buffer system. It is one of the main systems that keeps the pH of our blood stabilized within neutral ranges. Now, how this buffer system works is that bicarbonate ions, so this is bicarbonate ion right here. This is carbonic acid. So bicarbonate ions here can combine with free hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid to remove whatever amount of hydrogen ions that's in that particular solution to control its pH, okay, so that it doesn't become too acidic because remember, acidity or pH level is determined by how much hydrogen ions there are in the solution. But if you have something else that can sequester some of that and remove the hydrogen ions from the solution, then it prevents the pH from changing in the particular solution. So that forms carbonic acid, and this excess carbonic acid, after removal of hydrogen ions from the solution, it can be converted into carbon dioxide or water molecules. Of course, we know water molecules is something that we need in the body anyway, and it is, pH of 7 is a neutral solution. Carbon dioxide is something then we can exhale through our lungs, okay, to get rid of that, in a sense, getting rid of the hydrogen ions from all the way down here, okay? So if we happen to have a lot of hydrogen ions in our body, our bicarbonate ions can combine with it, take it away from solution, forming carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will dissociate readily into water molecules and carbon dioxide. Water will just use and absorb, and carbon dioxide is something we can breathe out easily through our lungs. Now, if it's the other way around, where the solution is too basic, then the equilibrium will shift backwards this way, okay? So if it's too acidic in the body, the buffer system allows the driving the equilibrium that way. If it's too basic, it drives the equilibrium backwards this way, okay? Depending on whether it is your body's too acidic or basic, okay, to maintain that stabilized pH, okay? So when it's too basic, your carbon dioxide and water can form more carbonic acid, and more carbonic acid can then be dissociated into your hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, and that amount of hydrogen ions produced will replace and replenish the hydrogen ions to lower your pH back to normal. Because it's too basic to begin with, you need more hydrogen ions to lower the pH back to normal, okay? If it's too acidic, you need to form carbonic acid, release it into the air or as water molecules to lower your to raise your pH back to normal, okay? So make sure you're very clear of these pH numbers and whether it's acidic or basic when we talk about different numbers of pH, numerical value of pH. Don't mistake lower pH value as more basic, okay? Or don't mistake higher pH value as more acidic, okay? So it's opposite. Higher value means more basic. Lower pH value means more acidic, okay? All right. Now, without this particular buffer system in the human body, pH levels will fluctuate too much, and that's what we were talking about. We will end up with a health condition called acidosis or alkalosis, depending if your pH is too high or too low, and that can jeopardize the survival of the organisms or, basically all the cells around the body. So you can easily remember that bicarbonate ions can neutralize acid if you remember what Tums do, okay? If you've ever had heartburns, remember that they recommend for you to take a tablet of Tums. So why one experiences heartburn is because the stomach acid is traveling upwards into your esophagus. So your stomach lining, in itself is designed to be able to handle that very low pH of the stomach acid. But sometimes that stomach acid can travel upwards into your esophagus, for example, when you burp or something, or, when you're vomiting, all that stuff. So your esophagus lining is not is not designed to handle that low pH or acidity of the stomach acid. So it ends up feeling like it burns when the stomach acid travel upwards into your esophagus. And one of the active ingredient in Tums is calcium carbonate. Okay, and we just discussed that bicarbonate ion is what will be able to act as a buffer and neutralize your acid. So calcium carbonate will essentially become the bicarbonate ions that can neutralize those extra hydrogen ions in the esophagus area, and you feel better almost instantly after you have taken a tablet of Tums. Now, chewing the Tums tablet will put those bicarbonate ions into solution and allows it to act as a buffer for your esophagus. All right, I know we're at an hour, but bear with me. We're almost done here. We have the last section of the chapter, which goes over the concept of some of the concepts we will use in the next chapter of biomacromolecules. Okay, so, let's call it a break here. So in case you want to come back later to this last part, you can. Okay, so we'll call it a break here in part 2 of the chapter 2. This is one of the longer chapter. Okay, chapter 3 is also another long chapter. Okay. All right, and we'll come back in part 3 of chapter 2 to talk about this last section, which won't be long. Probably, I would say 15 to 20 minutes.